Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Oxford PPE webinar. We will be getting started very shortly, so I'll just share my screen. Today's webinar is Oxford PPE, how to apply for 3 subjects in one, how to do a 3-in-1 application and succeed, okay? Because, of course, PPE is 3 separate subjects, and not only are you going to be applying for 3 separate subjects, there are actually 3 key parts to this application process. So we're going to be covering all of that in today's session. I've already asked that. So just to kind of introduce some of us here, my name is Carol. I'm the founder here at the Oxbridge Formula, and we started running the Oxbridge Formula around 8 years ago. We've helped lots and lots of students through the application process. I myself, there in my graduation outfit, and graduated from Balliol College, one of the most famous PPE colleges, or I think the most famous PPE college. All right, Josh disagrees. Out in Oxford, and I didn't do PPE myself, but I then went on to become a teacher. And have helped lots of students at school while they were applying to Oxford and Cambridge. And then, you know, Chris and I started this. So Chris is the guy in the middle. He is one of our tutors. He studied maths and philosophy at Oxford and is one of our critical thinking tutors and one of our philosophy tutors. An excellent explainer of difficult concepts, I'd say. He can make something that seems very, very difficult and tricky to you seem very straightforward and easy. So he's got a really good skill there. Again, a first-class graduate. And then Josh is the third person on the picture. He is a current PPE student at Oxford. If you just want to say just literally hi to everybody.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Josh. I do PPE at Oxford. I'm at Trinity College, so Balliol's classic rival.
Wow, I didn't actually know that. Okay, yeah, Balliol and Trinity are like right next to each other and they kind of don't like each other. So, okay, sorry, Josh, I didn't know that. Anyway, so what was I going to say? So Josh is going to really be talking about his own personal experiences of studying PPE at Oxford. You know, what did he do to get in? Like, what did he do to prepare? How did he tackle the TSA? And at the end, we gave you guys 3 interview questions to look at, and he's going to be talking you through model solutions for how he would tackle all of those. So without further ado, we will get started. But before that, I also wanted to introduce you to Jansu. Jansu, if you want to say a quick hi.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, so Jansu is one of our programs consultants. We're going to be talking a little bit about the programs that we offer as well. And if you do decide to book in a call, you'll be speaking with either myself or Jansu. So it would be a good idea to introduce her, I thought. Okay, so moving on. These are just some of the students who have worked with us and have been successful at getting a place at Oxford and Cambridge. But now talking about Oxford PPE admissions. So the contents of today's webinar: why choose a 3-in-1 degree like PPE? How competitive is it to get in for PPE? And we're going to talk about, we've talked about the 3-stranded degree, the 3-in-1 degree, but we're going to talk about the 3-in-1 application process for being successful at getting a place at Oxford. And that consists of the TSA multiple choice section, the TSA essay, and the PPE interviews. And I know a lot of you had questions about the TSA when we asked you about questions, so I think that section will be particularly helpful. And then lastly, how to prepare for the TSA and the interview. And at the end, we're going to have an open Q&A. So throughout today, if you have a question that you want us to answer at the end, do not put it in the chat box because it will probably get lost in amongst multiple other things that we're going to be asking you to put in the chat. Instead, if you could put it in the Q&A box, which we should see on the Zoom panel, that will be the best place where at the end we will take all of those questions and answer them. So without further ado, let's get started. And the first thing I want to ask Josh is, why choose a 3-in-1 degree like PPE? So we've got a few things here, Josh. If you could maybe kind of talk about why you wanted to study it and what key reasons are that people might want to study this degree.
Yeah, so I love studying PPE, and I think the first reason for that is the academic diversity of it. So coming into my kind of university application process, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do. I knew I had some interests in politics. I was interested in how the world works. I'd done some work in economics, but I wasn't really sure where I wanted to end up. And doing PPE at Oxford, you get to do a wide range of topics, and they're all interesting in different ways. So I can look at things from different angles. I can look at everyday life. I can look at whatever I'm interested in philosophically, and I can approach it all in different ways. And I think the second part of it that's kind of linked to that is the academic freedom of the course. So I think there's a lot of degrees wherever you end up, that you end up almost on a set path. So you need to do these courses, then these courses, and these other courses. And once you've applied for something when you're 17 or 18, you've kind of locked yourself in for life. But with PPE, you can choose your own path through the degree. So I'll talk a bit more about that process later and what it actually looks like. But there's a huge number of optional modules. So whatever I was interested in or whatever I discovered at university, I knew I'd be able to do. And if there's something I didn't enjoy as much, I could kind of just skip over that and wouldn't need to keep going back to it. And finally, which is as much a fun thing as everything, is the relevance of the degree. So you're constantly discussing issues that are being deliberated around the world. I mean, I know, for example, in early March this year, I was doing my international relations module and talking to a tutor who's an expert on international relations the day after Russia launched an invasion on Ukraine about the causes of the conflict, how it fit within existing thought, what he thought we ought to do about it. And just kind of the sense of you're always talking about the things that are going on in the real world. You're talking about these big issues, but you can break them down. You can think carefully about them. And you can really hear from experts on how to approach them in a new way.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. And what are the benefits of studying kind of 3 subjects rather than just one kind of?
Well, I think one of them is kind of what I was talking about earlier, how it's really flexible, partially because you have the 3 different strands that are all huge topics in their own right. So you can really break into different subjects and what you really want to do. And also just the subjects weren't individually available at Oxford. So if you want to do any of these subjects at Oxford, you're going to have to do them with something else. And philosophy, politics, and economics is the only one that combines the 3. There are other combinations with each of them, but this is the only way you get to take those 3.
Okay, that sounds good. So what does the course look like? So how was your first year structured?
So the first year is when you really get to learn about the different subjects. And it's interesting because it's a degree that compared to a lot of others, people are coming in with a lot less knowledge. I know there's many people who may have done some kind of philosophy or economics at A levels, but really a lot of the students at Oxford, like I was coming in with kind of an interest in politics, and I'd done one economics course when I was in high school in Canada, but that was it. And I was really coming in as introduction, and you get to do that. So in your first year, you take all 3 subjects. They're all compulsory, and you do basically introductions to each. So you'll have introduction to microeconomics and macroeconomics, introductions to moral philosophy and general philosophy, and so on. And you do those throughout the course of the year. Then at the end of the year, in your last term, you're going to have 3 3-hour exams. So 1 for each subject. And in each of these exams, you're going to write 4 essays or answer 4 problems over the course of 3 hours. Then, yeah, those are your prelims. You pass those, you move on to your second year, which is where I am now. And this is when the choices I was talking about really start to open up. So the first thing is that you can choose to keep all 3 of the subjects, or you can drop down to 2. For example, I know some people that came in really hating maths and never wanting to touch economics again. So as soon as we got through prelims, they'd say, all right, we're going down to just philosophy and politics. Or people on the other side who really want to do the maths, do empirical research, and do basically quantitative politics and economics. And in this year, you do 2 modules each term. So the Oxford year is split into 3 terms. Right now, we're in the last of those, the nice Trinity summer term. But in each of your terms, you're going to do 2 modules. And in each of those modules, you're going to be writing basically an essay a week. So throughout the year, you do 2 essays a week, a total of 6 modules. And then at the end of the year, you get to relax. You have no exams. It's all really nice until you get to your 3rd year. And then you have 2 more modules in your first 2 terms and revision for the 6 modules you did in your 2nd year. And those have the same structure as the ones you did in your 2nd year, except if you want, you can replace one module with a thesis. So I'm choosing to do a philosophy thesis, for example, instead of doing one of my modules. Then at the end of that year, you have 8 exams. So one for every module you've done through your second and third year exams. And those will give you your final grades at the end of the course.
You can kind of relax a bit in second year, but then you've got to make up all of that work and do the exam for it in third year. Okay, makes sense. So what kind of modules can you take, say, in philosophy?
I mean, there's a huge range of modules you can take. So there's some that are kind of basic or intro courses. So for example, ethics, knowledge of and reality both give you overviews of really broad topics. But then you can start getting into the specifics. So you can do philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion. I'm doing practical ethics right now, which I'm really enjoying, where we're talking about issues like abortion, euthanasia, animal rights. So there's a lot of options. You can specialize in whatever you'd like. Politics is the same. There's courses like political sociology, international relations, political theory. You can do theories of justice. You can do comparative government, looking at different structures and different governments around the world. In economics, there's also a number of options, although a bit fewer than in philosophy or politics. So those include kind of basic microeconomics, macroeconomics. But you can also do things like development of the world economy, which is almost more of a history paper. You can do quantitative economics. You can do game theory, which I've always really enjoyed. So there's a lot of different options. This is just a small set of the many, many second and third year options you can sort through.
Okay, and then when you go to start, when you study this degree, how are you taught?
So I touched on this briefly earlier, but for every module you're doing in every year, basically, you're going to have either one essay or one problem sheet each week. The essays range in length depending on what you're doing, but are normally in the kind of 1,500 to 2,500 word range. Problem sheets are basically just in economics and will be a series of math questions, sometimes with mini essays. So you'll finish that, you'll be assigned it, and then you'll submit it normally the day before your tutorial. And then you'll have a 1 hour or sometimes hour and a half tutorial with your tutor and 1 or 2 other students where you'll go through your work and talk about what to improve on. And this can look different with different tutors. So some tutors will focus a lot on the readings and what you were expected to learn. Some will make you read your essay out and then ask other students to critique it. But no matter what, it's going to be a really interesting discussion with one of the top experts in the world and then a few other students who are there next to you trying to get through it. And so you'll normally end up writing 14 to 16 essays per term or 14 to 16 problem sheets.
Okay. And can I just check? So in economics, you also have tutorials? And if you're not going through essays, what do you do in those?
Economics, you'll normally just go through the problem sheet. So it's not really expected that you get everything on every problem sheet, right? If you can, it's great. But most of the time, people will have things to work on, things to do. If you have gotten through that all quickly, then sometimes you can get into discussions about broader implications or further learning or whatever you're interested in. But the tutorial systems are pretty similar there.
Okay. Sorry.
The big difference between economics and the other courses, I think, is in terms of how the lectures work. So economics is quite lecture heavy, not to the same extent as some STEM courses. So if you're doing medicine at Oxford, you're in lectures for most of your time here. And economics isn't quite that, but you do a lot of your learning through going to lectures and watching how the lecturers work through your problems. Whereas politics and philosophy, you still have some lectures, but normally it's maybe 1 or 2 lectures a week for a module. And the focus is really on independent reading. So you'll be sent a reading list with a huge variety of things, and you will have some core readings that you're expected to do no matter what. And then often you'll get 2 or 3 pages of further readings, and you can kind of pick what sounds interesting or what sounds like what you want to learn about. And you can, in a way, just kind of do the reading you want to do and work your way through it independently.
Yes, I think as a STEM student myself, I was really interested or intrigued to hear that you don't have many lectures. I mean, give me an idea for, say, something like philosophy. How many lectures a week would you have on that?
It'll depend on the term. So normally at the start of the year, you'll have maybe 3 or 4 lectures a week. Whereas by this term, by Trinity term at the end of the year, you'll have max 1.
Wow.
Partially because if you're in second and third year, if you're in third year, they don't want exams in your final term.
Yes.
So they front load them. But often the politics and philosophy lectures, especially the philosophy ones, are more about helping you understand how the readings fit together than actually introducing new material. So you'll get your reading list about a bunch of things about different definitions of knowledge, for example, because we'll be talking about that later. And then you'll go to the lecture and they'll just kind of say, here's how these are all classified. Here's a brief summary of each kind of approach and where they fit in. But you're not really learning through the lectures. You're more fitting pieces together and helping crystallize your understanding.
Okay, that's actually really, really useful to understand. And I remember when we were talking, you were saying philosophy reading in particular can be quite difficult. So if there are any students here who are thinking, oh, I want to go through some philosophical texts, in preparation for my interview, or even like when you're doing study at university, what tips do you have for how students can make the most of the philosophy reading they do?
Yeah, philosophy reading can be really weird and quite different from a lot of the reading you might be used to doing. So sometimes if you're doing reading in, English, for example, you get a long book and you need to read through it. But philosophy is often very dense. So it's going to be shorter articles or shorter books that are really focused on argument. So when you're trying to read it, I think the first thing is always focus on the argument. Philosophers love arguing and they're always trying to prove something. So you really want to see how that works. And one of the easiest ways to do that is use the introduction and conclusion of an article to see how the argument is set out.
When you say article, do you mean article or do you mean paper, journal?
Paper. So these are normally about 30-page papers that you'll find. And they'll often have kind of an abstract and intro and then a conclusion that will tell you how the argument is supposed to work and what steps it takes. And other useful tips for reading this is reading objections or responses, because often when you have really good objections to a piece, so you have something one author wrote, then someone else came along and said, no, this is wrong. The second person is going to first focus on, here's the summary of what the first person said, and then identify the weaknesses of that. And then also, if you want to really push yourself and really understand the philosophy, imagine counter arguments and how the author might respond, or you can imagine thought experiments. Philosophers often use thought experiments in their writing. So you can mess around with those, think if one little thing changed, what would happen to the thought experiment here, or so on.
Okay, what about in politics? So how would you recommend students make the most of reading they do in politics?
Politics is quite different. So as I was saying with our reading lists, philosophy, you get these 30-page papers that are very dense. Politics, you'll get a list of law and books to read, but they're often a lot less dense and more focused on kind of empirical data and how things work together. So the focus with these readings, at least in my experience, is to understand it, but don't spend too much time reading it. So sometimes in philosophy, you'll have a paragraph that's really dense and you just need to spend 10, 15 minutes staring at the paragraph. In politics, that won't happen as much. But what you can do is look for complementary papers. So you might have, for example, a paper on the history of British politics in the late 1900s. And it may be really useful if you want to compare that to another and how parliamentary trends or electorate trends change. And it may be really useful to compare that to, for example, how the same trends, the same time period in France or in Germany or in the US or whatever it may be. And it's about fitting these different papers into an overall picture. So they'll give you different perspectives, different ideas on how things might work. And it's often about fitting them together instead of comparing arguments. And again, if you want to do really well and think critically about these, think about issues with their research methods. So how they actually get their data, their approaches, and of course their arguments. And think about how else we could explain whatever data they have. If they've collected survey data on which countries go to war, think about if, for example, they're focusing only on one time period, perhaps during the Cold War, when there's some other explanation for why it's Eastern and Western countries going to war, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay, this kind of reminds me of the module you run in the economic summer course, where we look at data graphs. Would you say that this is quite similar to what you cover in that?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of really useful skills about looking at how we can look at data and develop meaningful conclusions. So both look at what data gives us, but also how else we could explain it and what other trends are important.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. So we're looking at why PPE. I guess another thing that's important is what kind of careers can you go into afterwards? So Josh, tell us some of the careers that people choose to go to after PPE.
So PPE is a very broad degree with people going a lot of different places. I mean, the classic stereotype, of course, is that all PPEists are politicians, which very much isn't true. But here I have just kind of a list of what the Oxford Career Service has said PPE graduates have gone to. So it includes things like local government, public service, and policy, but also law, banking, consulting, accounting, marketing, risk management, think tanks. There's a lot of different options, and a lot of it will come down to what you find most interesting. For example, economics students who really love the financial analysis will probably gravitate towards consultancy.
Yeah. Okay. And then thinking about careers like consultancy, looking at the average sort of salary for a PPE graduate 5 years after graduating, we can see that compared to the general or the average salary for an Oxbridge graduate, it's significantly higher. So it's a very well-paid degree. And we can also see the comparison between the Oxford median salaries after 5 years and salaries at, say, other Russell Group universities or all universities, or even people with no degree. So it's a well-paid degree. The careers that you're going to get after studying PPE are going to be good, or you have got lots of good options for you. So the next thing really then to talk about is we've said why we want to study it, right? But the next thing we have to do is to actually get in. And it's important, I think, to understand how competitive the degree is. So just to give you a summary, I don't know exactly what year this is from, but in a particular year, we had 1,994 applicants, and 37% of those were interviewed. So we got 733 people interviewed. And of the 1,994, 264 were successful at gaining a place, which is 13% of all of the applicants. So essentially, where do these numbers come from, and why is there a drop-off? Well, between all the applicants and the people who are interviewed, it's the TSA score that is of particular importance. So you're going to be picked for interview based on what you get in the TSA, which, if you're not familiar, is the thinking skills assessment, and we'll go into that in just a second. And then taking you from the 733 to the 264, that is based on how you perform at interview primarily. A little bit about how you perform in the TSA, but mostly how you perform in the interview. So just to show you a graph, it's a graph of the same data, but you can see there's a significant drop off. Only 13.2% of people are indeed successful, which basically means that 87% of people who apply for PPE are not successful. So it's an incredibly competitive degree. And if we look at, well, one thing I wanted to say was GCSE grades and A-level grades and how do they matter? So Chris, do you want to just quickly talk us through GCSE grades for PPE offer holders?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, we can see a graph here. And this is looking at the number of what Oxford think of as A-star grades, but which at school you probably think of as grades 8 or 9 out of 9 at GCSE. And obviously this is for UK applicants. And if we look at the color code, so it's the yellow on top who are people who didn't receive an interview at all, gray if you received an interview but you didn't get an offer, and then orange if you were offered a place. And so we're looking at numbers of high grades, 8s and 9s. And these are all the applicants. So we can see that a lot of people do have 10, 11 or more grades 8 or 9, but that's still not a guarantee you will actually get an offer. So Pablo, if you just click, I think you'll highlight one of the bars. So if we look here at this bar of, like, a lot of people only take 10 GCSEs, and these are the people who got 10 grades 8 or 9. But even in that bar, the orange portion of that bar is only maybe a quarter of the total. So even if you have 10 grades 8 or 9, you maybe only have a 25% chance to get an offer. Well, it's not like it's not completely random. It's not like they pick you out of a hat. That's because whether you get an offer depends on more than just your GCSE grades. It also depends on, as we discussed, your TSA score and how well you did in interviews. So this goes to show that having really good GCSEs is great, but it's not sufficient to get you a place.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, you know, the better your GCSE grades, the better for you, but it's not the end of the story. And there's still a lot more work that needs to be done to be successful at gaining that offer. Bear in mind, though, that Oxford do say for UK students applying for an undergraduate course, we look at information about the applicant's school, neighbourhood and experience in the care system. And applicants from the most disadvantaged backgrounds will be strongly recommended to be shortlisted for interview, provided, now this is the bit that I want you to all listen to, provided that they are predicted to achieve the standard conditional offer for the course. So they need to have the right predicted grades, and importantly, they perform to an appropriate standard in any required pre-interview admissions test. So even if your GCSE grades aren't good for whatever reason, maybe it's based on your school or your context, they're still expecting you to have that really good TSA score. So I wanted to kind of bring that to your attention. The other thing I wanted to say is the standard offer for PPE is AAA. And that's not even that high. We're not even talking about any A stars within that. I think, you know, many of you watching this webinar would think, yeah, I can easily get my AAA. But this is a graph of people and how people who were offer holders for Oxford PPE and how many A star grades that they had predicted at the time of application. So Chris, if you want to quickly take us through this.
Yeah, so as you can see, the biggest bar there is for people who had 3 predicted A star grades, or achieved. So it could be that they'd already taken the exam the year before. And so 3 A stars is a lot more than what's required for the offer. It's more than 3 A's. But even if you're predicted that, if we look at that bar, so this is from Oxford's own site, and they've changed their colour scheme, but now again, like the blue on top is people who aren't interviewed, yellow is interviewed and not offered a place, and it's the grey at the bottom now who are the people offered a place. And just having 3 predicted A stars doesn't mean you have a great chance of getting an offer. So that's maybe like 1/8 of the total people with 3 or more A stars who are getting offers in the end. So again, we see that having good predicted grades is really important, but firstly, almost everyone has really good predicted grades, and there's not many people in the 1 and 2.
I mean, I think what I want to add to that is a lot of people can think, oh, I've made my AAA grades, like that's good enough for Oxford, I'm going to get in, sort of thing. And you can see that from the actual people who get in, i.e. the grey bars here, most of them have got 3 or 4 A star grades, not just A grades. So don't let the fact that the offer is lower lull you into a false sense of security that, oh yeah, I've done enough for my A levels to get in. Like, obviously they're not getting in because of their A level grades, but it's the type of person that's getting 3 or 4 A star grades that in the end is the most successful. But even then, like Chris said, it's not enough. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this webinar, we'll talk about the remaining bits that you need to do in order to achieve that. Is that okay, Chris? Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So some of you might be thinking right now, gosh, it's so competitive. These guys are saying that my A star grades aren't enough, Like, is there any point in me even applying? So to that, I would definitely answer yes. What are some of the benefits of applying to Oxbridge? Preparing for Oxbridge, right? You are preparing yourself to think outside the box, to think critically, to problem solve, to read about things you never would read about, to think in a way, as we saw from that philosophy reading, that you never would have thought about before. And what is that going to naturally do? Firstly, it will make you better at your A levels, right? Especially if you're taking any of the PPE A levels. Preparing for, say, an interview in one of these subjects is going to make you understand your subject better and deeper, and therefore will allow you, say, in politics, philosophy, economics, to do even better. Say you prepare for Oxbridge and you really do as much as you can for the TSA, you improve your critical thinking skills, your problem solving skills, your knowledge of the subjects, your ability to argue and make a good argument, but you happen to miss your place at Oxbridge, right? Because it is very competitive. the skills you have learnt are not going away from you, right? They are going to stay with you. And if you study a similar course, a social science course, a PPE course at any other university, you will hit the ground running. And I can tell you this, I didn't, like I said, I'm not a social scientist, but when I was applying for my degree, which is maths at Oxford, I took the step papers, which I didn't need for Oxford at all. But the process of kind of applying to sit them just off my own back and doing that work, I think helped me get a first in every single module I did at Oxford. So it was really, really helpful, the fact that I'd done that preparation. So I can say with my own personal experience that, you know, going through the Oxbridge application process will make you better at any other university. And lastly, you just won't have the regret of not having tried and not having given it your best shot, because you don't know unless you try, right? You don't know what your limits are. You don't know whether you can get in. So I would strongly recommend, if this is something that you think would be a good path for you, give it a go, because I think it's a fantastic experience. Plus, what you have to remember is Oxford is only one of 5 choices, right? So as long as you put down a good range of universities that you really do want to go to and you're interested in, and Oxford is one of those, then yeah, it's one choice and you still have 4 other choices. So we've got the 3-in-1 PPE admissions process. We've talked about the 3-in-1 degree so far. I want to talk about the application process that is also in 3 parts. So you have to submit your UCAS form by the middle of October. If you're an international student, it might be slightly different, but for British students, it is the middle of October. And then before that, you probably spend, you know, kind of summer term, summer holidays, writing your personal statement and then submitting it by then. The TSA takes place at the beginning of November. So between now and the TSA exam, we'd recommend you getting on with your TSA preparation. You might think, well, that's quite a long time, but there are lots of skills that you need, and it's an extremely time-pressured exam. So we definitely recommend getting started soon. Interviews tend to take place on the first, second weeks of December for PPE. And what you'll notice here is that we don't say, after I finish my TSA, I'll do a couple of weeks of interview preparation, because that's a trap that a lot of students fall into. But what you're going to see today when we talk about how you need to do interview preparation is how much depth you're required to go into, how you're required to think in a different way and think a lot more deeply than you maybe would at A-level. So those skills aren't skills that come overnight. So again, interview preparation is something that we would recommend you start doing now. And the primary way of doing that is by doing extra reading and thinking about material and forming arguments. And I think it's important to talk about how the different components of the application process vary for PPE. Now, Josh, I'd like to know your opinion. Personal statement we've put there is not that big a proportion. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so what my experience was and what I've heard from other students and tutors at Oxford is that PPE is a course for which the personal statement really doesn't matter that much. If you're applying for some courses, it really matters that you've shown a recurring interest and done all the extracurriculars that are specifically related to that. But because PPE is broad, people come from very different backgrounds, very different interests, and your personal statements will probably be read. They might ask you about things you've said you're particularly interested in. And it's good to show that you do have an actual interest in the subject, but it's not really an important part of the admissions process in the same way. The focus of your application is going to be on how you perform on your admissions test and on your interview, and to some degree on your predicted grades. And the personal statement will always be kind of secondary to that.
Okay. Now let's then talk about component 1, which is the TSA multiple choice section, and component 2, the TSA essay. So Chris, talk us through the different parts of the TSA.
Okay, so we'll look at paper 1 first. So both paper 1 and paper 2 are taken in a single sitting at the start of November. Paper 1, you're given 90 minutes. And the subjects are what are called problem solving and critical thinking. We'll see some examples in just a second, but they're not based on any A-level knowledge or really any subject specific knowledge from school. They're testing your ability to solve problems and think critically. So when you see some examples of questions, you'll see that they're not at all subject specific. There are 50 multiple choice questions in that section, which means you have 108 seconds, so less than 2 minutes per question. There can be quite a lot of text and stuff to do, so that's really not a lot of time. It is very time pressured. You aren't allowed a calculator or dictionary, as it says. And then after paper 1, you go straight on to paper 2, for which you have 30 minutes. So that's an essay paper. You're writing one essay in 30 minutes. You have a selection, as it says, you choose one question from 4 on a range of topics. They tend to be things that are vaguely related to economics, politics, well, and philosophy. So the strands of PPE. Questions that might sound kind of relevant if you're into current affairs. And you get a choice of 1 from 4. And again, there's no, well, obviously you would need a calculator, but there's also no dictionary.
Okay, so let's have a look at a snapshot of paper 1. So you said here that there's no A-level content required. We've got, in the multiple choice section, we're split up into problem solving and critical thinking. So problem solving is quantitative, spatial, and algorithmic reasoning. So we're going to look at that in a second. And then critical thinking is where you have to read a passage, identify the main conclusion or flaws in the argument or assumptions made in the argument to figure out, to answer the questions. And it can be useful to revisit some parts of GCSE maths, which especially if you don't do maths will be very useful, such as ratio, proportion, speed, distance, time graphs, and so on and so forth. So Chris, talk us through some of these.
Okay, so this is an example problem solving question. You can see it's quite numerical. You have to take some data from the tables in order to answer it. There is also a couple of paragraphs at the bottom describing the problem. So even when it's not just like looking up one piece of data from the table, you've somehow got to solve a problem with it and get a numerical answer. If we look at critical thinking, on the other hand, that one's going to be based on a passage. Pablo, if you just bring this one up for me. So you see you have a paragraph to read. This is kind of a medium-sized paragraph. They can get even longer than this. So you've got to read this, understand it. And then this question, if you look at the one line under that paragraph, says, what's the best statement of the flaw in the argument? So you've got to analyze this argument and find how it's flawed. Paper 2 is, as we said, the essay section. So this is showing you how there's a selection of 4 questions. They're quite short, but that means they're quite open-ended and there's very little guidance. And you can see that they're topics you might be familiar with if you're interested in current affairs. So like imposing like a maximum salary in question 3. And one thing I noticed about this is, like, why is the paper like this? So paper 1 is made as it is because they're testing your thinking skills in some way. Why is the essay paper set out like this? Because it's kind of like how Oxford likes to examine their undergraduates anyway, at least in some subjects. So some papers won't be like this, but here we show a selection of 4 questions from the start of an Oxford politics paper. And you can see they're like similar in length. They're also open-ended. There's maybe some more like specialist terminology, like what is a hybrid regime in the top question. But in format and in the way you approach them, they're actually kind of similar. Josh, I don't know if that reflects your experience at Oxford.
Yeah, I agree. I think that TSA paper 2 is largely a matter of trying to figure out if you can write an Oxford essay and what it would look like when you are. So as you move through your degree, you'll get more specific knowledge you need to incorporate, but the general strategies and approaches that they want to test and see how you can do are very similar to what you'll be trying to show here.
Okay, and then how is a TSA used? Thanks, Chris and Josh, for that. So it's, as I said already, it's used pre-interview to decide who to invite to interview, which is obviously extremely important for Oxford. And it's also used post-interview combined with interview performance to decide who to make offers to. I think Oxford tends to use interview more than looking at the TSA as well, but it will be considered at the same time. And it's used to test your potential. So how mentally agile are you? How quickly can you tackle hard and unfamiliar questions? And are you fluent with key ideas or techniques? And in terms of how important the TSA is for shortlisting, this is actually a table that Oxford produces themselves. And they say that TSA grades and GCSE grades are of high importance for shortlisting. In other words, shortlisting means for shortlisting for interview. So TSA is really, really important. If you don't have the right predictor grades, you're not going to get shortlisted for interview. GCSE grades are very important. I think they are taking into account circumstances around COVID. So if that's a concern, then don't worry too much. And you can just see that the TSA is kind of one of the most important factors. It's still within your control. Okay, so how challenging is the TSA? Chris, talk us through this graph, please.
Okay, there's a very technical looking graph. So they use what's called a rash model. The name of it doesn't really matter, but it just means they're converting the scores. And they're trying to convert them. So they basically have the same distribution of scores every year. And then they can easily say what the cutoff's going to be, because it should be roughly the same each year. So if you look at the scale on that, so at the bottom we've got basically the height of the bar is the proportion of candidates getting that kind of score, and then the horizontal axis is the score. You can see that the horizontal axis, the scores aren't evenly packed together, but so essentially the bars aren't all the same width. So there's basically more bars between 60 and 65 than there are between 80 and 85. A lot more. And that's because a lot more students get between 60 and 65. So they've chosen this scoring model. So it basically packs everyone in the middle. And if you're in the middle, you're actually unlikely to get shortlisted. The middle is not a good place to be. You want to be to the right-hand side of that middle, where there's much fewer people getting those scores. So if you really want to be confident of getting an interview, you want 70 plus to make yourself stand out. Paolo, if you just bring up the next couple of bullet points, that you see, as it says, the average applicant should be scoring about 60. Everyone's packed around 60. You don't really want to be average. You need to score more.
Well, yeah, we need to be in the top 13%, or at least the top 30-ish% to be shortlisted, and the top 13 really to be in with a chance of a place.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's a bit more on that here.
Yeah, so we've got a few slides coming up. So this is showing the overall TSA score, which we just saw is scaled to between 0 and roughly 100. And if we look at, so we're saying 60, so that's the column just under Paolo's pointer there. What are your chances of being offered a place if you score just a bit more than 60? Well, the people offered a place are in blue there, that little bar right at the bottom. So that's not a large proportion. If we go to people who are scoring, say, 70 to 75, okay, it's still not a huge proportion because the rest of your application also matters, but you still have to do an interview. But it's at that point you start making a significant proportion. So it's maybe a third of people scoring that who get offers. And the proportion getting interviews is quite high. It's 2/3 to 3/4, because that's the blue and orange together. Once you score 75 plus, you're very, very likely to get an interview.
Yeah, so I think it's good, like everyone should be aiming here to try and get 75% as a converted score. And if you're doing past paper practice, you can find score conversions online to figure out what your rash converted score would have been. Okay, but now let's split this between the problem solving sections, Chris, and the critical thinking sections. How do they differ? Well, how do scores that PPE applicants get differ?
Okay, I just need to point out about this graph again. It's from Oxbridge. They changed the colors on us again. So now it's gray, which is on top, which are the people who get offers. And you can see the amount of gray increases as you go to the right, obviously, and it only starts getting a significant proportion once you're scoring 70 or more. The conversion doesn't exactly go up to 100, so it's slightly odd, but it's still roughly 70%. And the interesting thing is if you compare it to critical thinking, so problem solving is quite symmetrical. You can see everyone's kind of clustered in the middle. Critical thinking, everyone's clustered more to the right-hand side. So there's quite a lot of people scoring 70 or 75 or more. But if you really want to stand out, you need to score even higher. So in the critical thinking questions, it tends to be like, so maybe there's 25 on a paper, maybe most of the candidates are getting around 20, and you need to get 23, 24, almost 100% to actually stand out.
Actually, that is very interesting because Josh actually got 100% in the critical thinking questions he did in his paper, which is extremely impressive, and really grateful that he's able to help our TSA applicants. Right, okay, everybody ready? Just put in the chat, are you still with me? Just say, yes, I'm still here. Yes, I'm still awake. Put something in the chat so I know you're all still here. Okay, getting a yes. By the way, oh, I love it. Loads of yeses. What's your favorite part of the webinar so far? Tell me in the chat. Somebody says the favorite part is the TSA part. Oh, lots of people with the TSA. Yes. Josh's experience, seeing the stats about the TSA, all of the graphs. You're gonna be great politicians and economists. Knowing the percentage I need to be successful with the TSA. Josh's accent. All right. The challenges that approach after GCSE, the data visualization. Okay, I'm glad you found that helpful, guys. Excellent. Right, so we are going to go on to do a TSA problem solving question, and you're going to have 108 seconds. Now, don't be alarmed. There's going to be like a little bell that rings or some kind of noise that happens. You get ready with a pen and paper. Okay. We're going to give you the 108 seconds, the amount of time you would have in the real thing to do this. And there's going to be options, I think A, B, C, D, E, and I want you to put them in the chat to me as soon as you think you have an answer. And at the end, I'm going to read them out and we're going to go through the solution. Okay, so ready, set, go. Do I press it again, Chris?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Oh no, I stopped it. Oh. Guys, you're getting extra time because I managed to stop the timer. No, I think time would nearly be up now, actually, but I'm going to read out the answers. Well, no, I'm not. Okay, put your answer in the chat in 20 seconds.
It was only stored about 10 seconds. It's fine.
Okay, fine. Okay, so given that I gave you 10 extra seconds, I think everyone put your answers in the chat now. Go, 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 go. You got 3, 2, and 1. Right, I'm going to read out what we've got in the chat just so. Okay, everyone stop. All right, so we've got, I'm just going to read out some random selection because we have a lot of different answers here, right? So we have, let's see, B, D, A, E, A, E, D, A, D, C, A, D, E, D, A, E, D, E, C, E, A. Right, so nobody thinks it's B, which is interesting. So, Chris, will you take us through how to actually do this question, please?
Yeah, absolutely. We just take us on to the next.
Oh, sorry.
I think so. There's a couple of key ideas here. We want to simplify this for ourselves, and this is what's called a spatial reasoning question, and which is one of the different types of problem-solving question you'll get. So we've got to move something around in 3D in order to solve this, which a lot of people do find difficult. So we need a way to keep track without having to imagine rolling a cube in our heads, because that's going to make us likely to make a mistake. And so a key tip that we give our students for dealing with this kind of question is looking for what we call pointers. So a shape that's pointing in a particular direction. Because if you keep track of that, it's going to help you keep track of where the whole shape is pointing. And they're kind of nice to you here. They put a triangle on the top, and the triangle is nice and pointy. It clearly points in a particular direction. So if we look at our track, at the beginning, the triangle is on top and it's pointing to the left. And based on where the triangle is, you can work out where all the other shapes are. So for instance, on the face immediately in front of the triangle is going to be the cross. That's what the net tells us. Behind is the square. To the left is the ring. To the right is the circle, and so on. So we'll just keep track of where the triangle is when we're rolling the cube. So maybe we'll just imagine rolling it a couple of times. It's on the top and it's rolling to the right. That's away from the direction it's pointing. So if you roll it twice, it's going to end up on the side faces and then on the bottom. And also because it's rolling in the direction it was pointing, it must have flipped when it got rotated 180 degrees. So it's going to be on the bottom pointing to the right. And it's always good to keep track of what you've learned. Have you learned any simplifying principles when you're doing a problem? Yeah, we've just kind of noticed, okay, if you roll it twice in the same direction, it swaps top and bottom. And we're about to roll twice to the right and then twice forward. So we'll use that principle again. So now we're rolling twice again, same direction. So it's going to end up on top. Now we're rolling at right angles to where it's pointing. So it's going to continue pointing in the same direction. So it's going to be on the top, pointing to the right. And then now we roll it twice more in the direction it's pointing. So it's going to be on the bottom and it's going to rotate it 180 again. So it's going to be pointing to the left. So we end up with a triangle on the bottom pointing to the left. And actually, it turns out in this question, we didn't necessarily need to care about which direction it was pointing in, because once we know it's on the bottom, we're asked what shape is on the top. It says we're asked what shape is facing up in the end position. So we just care what shape on the cube is opposite the triangle. In TSA spatial reasoning questions, good to know how to interpret a cube net. So it's going to be the face that's 2 away from the triangle on the net, which is the kind of skinny rectangle. That's going to be opposite the triangle and therefore it's going to be on top. So that's our answer. In a slightly harder question, we would have had to care which way the triangle was pointing, but we got away with it this time. So the answer is D.
All right, okay, so definitely a fair few Ds, but also a lot of people with different answers. So hopefully found Chris's explanation really helpful. I know for a fact I find these cube questions really tricky, and that was quite a nice, simple way of going about it. Okay, that's great. What's going on here? Okay, so the next type of question we get is critical thinking. There are 7 main types of critical thinking questions, right? So if we look at number 1, we're asked for which of the following is the which of the following best expresses the main conclusion of the argument. We're asked about drawing conclusions, which of the following can be drawn as a conclusion, which of the following is an underlying assumption of the argument, which of the following is the best statement of the flaw in this argument, which of the following, if true, would most weaken or strengthen this argument, and which best illustrates or expresses the principle underlying the argument, or most closely parallels the reasoning in the argument. Okay, and each of these 7 types of questions have a very specific way that you need to answer them. And here at the Oxbridge Formula, we've come up with, I guess you could say, formulas for answering these critical thinking types of questions. So we tell you what to look out for, we tell you what typical types of flaws there could be, and we even talk about within all of the options which ones are correct and why, but also which ones are incorrect and why, because normally when you get a question wrong, you're convinced that your answer is correct and you can't understand why it's not. So we look at all of this, and we actually do this through symbols. I'm going to show you some of those symbols after we do one critical thinking question together as well. So, okay, hopefully everyone is ready. Get your brains in gear. We are going to be doing another question. I'll put 108 seconds on. I'll try not to stop the timer this time. So we will start now. All right, 20 seconds. Okay, answers in the chat. Oh gosh, what's going on? My cursor is going weird. Okay, let's see. So we've got a lot of different responses again. So I have definitely not as many this time. So we've got ECAC, ECCC, EE, CEE, CEE, CCC, CECE, DDCCC. So a lot of C's, a few E's, and a couple of D's. So it's definitely between the C and the E. So let's have a look at what the correct answer is and why. Now, I think I need to share it with my sound, don't I? One sec, share with sound. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you one of the videos we have as part of our online resources. If you remember, I said that we've got 1,000+ questions, which we've explained in sort of video format. And what I want you to specifically be aware of course, think about how it's being explained. But what you're going to see is little symbols pop up. Now, these symbols might not make as much sense to you because you're going to be new to them. But a few little symbols are going to pop up. And they're going to explain, they're going to break down the argument into various sections. And they're also going to, we're also going to be talking about why the options are correct and incorrect. I think that will be very, very useful for you. So look out for that during this video. All right, just confirm if you can hear.
From the 2009 TSA. And in this question we asked what most weakens the argument. So let's have a look at the argument. First, we're told that zoos are unsuitable for animals or not the right places for animals. So since this is talking about what's good for animals, this is the writer's opinion. And then they say that people visit zoos to learn about animal behaviour. So that's just describing why people visit zoos as a fact. But they also say that animals are kept in small and unnatural spaces, which means they act abnormally. So this is a fact about how the animals act. And lastly, they say that zoos should be shut, reallocating the money to protect natural habitats. And this is the writer's opinion on what should be done based on what they've just said. So since this is a should type statement and everything else is a reason why we might think that zoos should be shut, it seems that sentence 3 is the conclusion. And so if we try to summarise the argument, well, the main factual claims about animal behaviour in zoos, so they say people are visiting to learn about the animal behaviour, but because the animals are acting unnaturally, the people who visit aren't going to be learning about how the animals would normally behave. And they also say that zoos aren't the right places for animals. This is going to be partly based on this claim probably, but it also sounds like a more general claim about what's good for animals. And then they conclude that zoos should be shut and the money should be used to protect natural habitats. So when the conclusion has two parts, shut the zoos and use the money for something else, it's important to remember both parts. As we see in this case, some of the options are on the first part and some on the second and some on both. So let's have a look at these options and see which would weaken the argument. So A says that living in cramped conditions also makes humans neurotic. So being neurotic is one of the ways the passage originally described animals acting abnormally, and it generally means being anxious or depressed. So if living in cramped conditions also makes humans neurotic, and one of the writer's points was that living in cramped conditions makes animals neurotic, would this being true weaken the argument? Well, in fact, it just seems like more evidence that the cramped conditions are to blame, which gives us more reason to shut down zoos. So this would actually seem to strengthen the argument. It's also worth noting this doesn't really address the idea of shutting zoos and protecting natural habitats, so it's unlikely to be the answer. So let's have a look at B. B says that by visiting zoos, school children can learn lots about animals. So how does this relate to the passage? Well, it does say that people visit zoos to learn about animals, but the animals aren't actually behaving normally, and that seems to be a reason for them to want to shut zoos, that you aren't actually learning how animals actually behave. And B seems to be undermining that, so it does seem to weaken the argument. However, as we'll see, there's actually a couple of options that weaken the argument in this case, so I won't conclude this is the correct answer now, we'll just look at the others first. If we look at C, C says that many animals currently living in zoos couldn't live in the wild. Would this weaken the argument? Well, it does seem to weaken it a bit, similar to B, except in this case it's directly attacking the conclusion, because if we're going to shut zoos, basically this is saying what happens to animals
in the zoos who wouldn't be able to live in the wild. This is giving us a reason not to shut zoos, and therefore it's weakening the conclusion. If we look at B, B says that protecting natural habitats is very expensive. So this obviously relates to part of the conclusion, protecting natural habitats. Does it weaken the argument? Well, you can read it two ways. So one would be protecting natural habitats is very expensive. So can we be sure that shutting zoos would actually give us enough money to fund that? We might think shutting zoos isn't even going to make a difference because it's so expensive, and that gives us a reason not to do it, or to use the money for something more affordable instead. But at the same time, we could read it as saying, or suggesting, that protecting natural habitats is very expensive, therefore we need all the money we can get, and that gives us more reason to shut zoos and use the money to protect natural habitats instead. So since this is something that could strengthen or weaken the argument, and there are other things that only seem to weaken it, this is unlikely to be the answer because that would be unfair. So we can reject this because it could strengthen the argument. So let's look at E. E says that zoos allow endangered species to survive because you can breed endangered species in them and then release them back into the wild. So would this weaken the argument? Well, again, it does seem like it would, because this gives us a reason not to shut zoos. Because if E is true, that might actually lead to endangered species dying out instead. So we have three things that seem to weaken the argument. Now we have to look at them in more detail. Which of these do you think most weakens the argument? Well, firstly, I think I can rule out B. Why is that? One reason is that it's only attacking one of the reasons for closing zoos, rather than attacking the very idea of closing them, whereas C and E would both give us reasons not to shut zoos at all. And another reason is that, okay, children can learn lots at zoos. That doesn't mean they're learning by observing the animals, which is what the argument says is a problem. They could be reading information panels or just learning what the different types of animals are, or other things that don't rely on the animals being in the zoos. So it seems like B doesn't weaken the argument as much as C or E would. And then between C and E, there's one of these I think would only undermine some ways of shutting zoos and not the whole idea of shutting zoos. And that's E. So E says we have to worry about the animals that are currently in zoos. But shutting zoos down doesn't have to mean doing it immediately and without care for the animals that are currently in them. We could stop adding new animals and wait for the current ones to die off and then close the zoo afterwards. Or we could find new homes for the current animals. So C doesn't have to be a problem. It's also worth noting that C only affects a small number of animals currently living in zoos, whereas E would affect whole species if we closed the zoos and that prevented endangered species from surviving. So it seems that C weakens the argument less than E, and E is the correct answer, because it gives us a reason not to shut down zoos at all.
Okay, so thank you very much. That was Chris who narrated that. And although it says stepmaster.co.uk, we used to do mainly maths, and now we do more subjects. So we've changed our name to the Oxbridge formula. But essentially, I think interesting there that a lot of you put C. But the thing to understand most is it says what most weakens the argument. So it's not like there's just one option. Sometimes you have to pick between two competing options and decide which one most weakens the argument. So hopefully you found that helpful. Okay, let's move.
So if you're watching one video, maybe it doesn't get across that if you've, say, been on our workshops or courses, you'll hopefully see how to answer this question more quickly than just eliminating all the options. You'll have a way directly to the answer. But you need to understand what exactly the TSA means by most weakens, which isn't maybe quite the same as the natural meaning. So it means giving you a strong reason to disagree with the conclusion. It doesn't actually care that much about the reasoning for getting there.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. I think there are so many shortcuts we can teach you. And as you probably all have seen, the TSA is extremely time pressured. So having these shortcuts and short ways of reasoning and thinking about it, I know personally for me, I found it incredibly useful, and I can do these questions much quicker now myself as well. So right, exam technique for multiple choice. I want to go through this really quickly because I'm very excited about the essay section, the interview section. But quickly, annotating and underlining, identifying key information from maths and problem solving. Have you used all of the information? Underlying conclusions, logical connectives, and should statements for critical thinking. Read the key part of the question. So what is the actual question asking? What is the main conclusion? What is the conclusion that can be drawn? What's the flaw? What's the assumption? if you're not sure, right at the end, just guess, because there's no negative marking. If you run out of time, you can guess. And remember constraints on the answers. Use, if you know that something can only be of a particular size, use your common sense to figure out what the right answer should be. And as we said, draw and underline as you read, circle and come back to questions that you are unsure about, eliminate incorrect responses as you go along, do lots of non-calculator practice. I think a lot of you guys might not be used to doing non-calculator work, especially if you do A-level maths, but you've got to get back into it. Keep numbers small and calculations simple. So cancel common factors whenever you can. And I am pleased that we've moved on to the TSA essay. But quickly, before we move on, if you did find that helpful and you think, oh gosh, I wouldn't mind having 1,000+ questions answered like that. No, we're not expecting you to look at all of them. It's whenever you're stuck and you're like, oh, I'm sure my answer's right. Why is this not the correct answer? That's when a video like this can be particularly helpful. And in teaching you the thought processes and techniques to make sure that you've got a formula to go through the question every time. Boom, 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 boom. I found the conclusion. I found this. Does this attack the reasons or the conclusion? It's conclusion. Boom. This must be the answer. And that's just one of our many formulas for the different types of questions. So if you think, oh, this could be very useful for me, and that's just one of the TSA things we offer, amongst live workshops run by Chris and economics workshops, social science workshops, and lots of interview preparation, then scan this QR code here. Or you can visit oxbridgeformula.co.uk/PPE-consultation. That is oxbridgeformula.co.uk/PPE-consultation. And just in about 20 seconds, I'll give you a chance to kind of scan that. I might grab myself a glass of water. And then we will move on to the essay section. And I know this is something that, because I don't know if you're aware, the TSA is used for multiple subjects, but a lot of them have scrapped the TSA essay part, but PPE most certainly hasn't. And you saw earlier that the PPE essay, TSA essay and the types of politics essays, for example, that you might write in a PPE degree are very similar. So there's a big correlation there. And I think that's why it's still used and looked upon quite a lot for PPE applicants, I should say. So yeah, I'll keep this on the screen for about 10 to 15 more seconds. Do scan it and see if there's a good opportunity to work with us. We do have not that many slots available actually in the next couple of weeks, but there are a couple that you might be able to grab. And as far as I'm concerned, if this looks like something that could be good for you, come and give it a go. Let's just see if there's something here that we can help you with. It's a free consultation, and the earlier you start, the better. As you saw in the diagram, we've had students starting on this program back in April or before. So I think the quicker you can get on after your exams, the better, and the more time we'll have to prepare you in the economics, politics and philosophy, as well as the TSA aspect of the application. Okay, so TSA essay, take it away. What are some key tips for the essay, Josh?
Yeah, so the essay is an interesting part of the TSA. And we were talking earlier about how the TSA is very time pressured. That's definitely true of section 1. It might even, I always found it was more true of section 2. So in section 2, you're going to have 30 minutes to write an essay. And it's very hard to write a good essay in 30 minutes, as you'll find out. So these are kind of some general tips of how to write an essay, and then we'll go into the specifics. So first, read all of the questions carefully and then pick one you understand. So what I mean by this is you don't want to spend too much time deciding because you don't have a ton of time, but you also want to make sure you understand every part of the question. So sometimes you might end up with questions you just don't know one word from or a term or something. If you see that, don't write that question. Pick one where you understand every word, know what you're talking about, and go on. Make a quick plan before you start writing. So again, you don't have a ton of time, but you'll actually lose more time if you just start writing without thinking and get lost. So taking a couple minutes to just get a sense of here's what I'm going to say is really useful. Make sure you consider both sides of the question. So if you just write a really one-sided essay, if you believe something really strongly and think that's the case and only write about that, it won't go over too well. So make sure you're thinking about both sides. And finally, focus on making your own argument. So you may have done past readings in the topic. You may know what some experts say on the subject. And if you know those, feel free to drop in a sentence citing them or talking about them. But the focus of these essays is really to see how you think about things and how you approach things. So the tutors reading these essays don't want to hear, oh, I've memorized all these authors and what they have to say about ethics. They want to hear, what do you actually think? What can you come up with when put on the spot, and how can you argue your way through that? So what does this actually look like in practice? So this is an example of a section 2 paper that you could get. So you must answer one of the following. You're given 4 questions in front of you, and they're all kind of related to different things. So the one that I've chosen to look at today is the 4th one. Does the response to the COVID-19 pandemic make serious political action on climate and environmental issues any more or less likely? And this question, as you can probably pick up on, is obviously related to politics and your understanding of that. It's also likely going to be related to your understanding of economic structures and also philosophy. So kind of what should we do? How do things work? So this is a really good question to highlight how you can respond to this. So, all right, I've picked this question I'm interested in. What do I start doing? And I'm looking at this in kind of 4 main sections. So the first thing I do, I have the question I've chosen. I think just kind of what are the important terms here? So what do I actually need to define or really think about? And the one that comes to mind when I look at this question is the phrase serious political action, because that's not really clear on what it means. It's kind of vague and open-ended. So make a note, this is something that I want to define or look at. Well, if you just want to click through here, I think we have this written down.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. So then just what ideas come to mind? So you can do some brainstorming, you can go through what immediately comes to mind. What do I want to argue? So what do I actually believe? What do I think I can make a stronger argument for? And don't worry too much about like, I'm making the right decision on this, because there's never going to be a right or wrong answer. It's just, what do you think you can argue better? And then finally, when you're thinking about structuring your essay, and I'll show you what I mean in a second, which pros and cons should I compare? So what am I actually looking at here? So I think on the next slide, we have the start of this. So when I'm just brainstorming, what reasons come to mind? And I think if we could get people to write in the chat, just immediate pros or cons. So you see this question, it's relevant to our lives. What are the first things you think of?
So when you say pros and cons, you mean, do reasons for people thinking it's more likely?
Yeah, and reasons for people thinking it's less likely. And this is what you have to do. You won't have much time, so you'll be going through what are your first thoughts, first responses. So if people can put that to me in the chat, that would be great.
So just to reiterate, where people are putting why it might be more or less likely that the response to COVID-19 would make serious political action on climate and environmental issues more likely or less likely. Give your reasons in the chat now, and I'll read some of them out. I'll start reading. So somebody said opportunity cost, quick government response to issues imposing threats to life on life and society as a whole. Less likely as they're now focused on economics issues instead. Maybe less likely there's a huge national debt putting climate change to the back of the short-term government agenda. Somebody said normalization of widespread government intervention on issues. Somebody says less likely the loss of growth will cause the government to prioritize economic growth. Somebody says less likely as funding to tackle climate issues. As less funding to tackle climate issues. More likely shows how shutting down certain parts of the economy can have huge impacts. I'm just going to read a few more. There's loads of really good things coming in. More likely to look at improving healthcare, so maybe a con. More likely as a joint response on COVID-19 means that the other joint projects like climate change are more conceivable. Less likely the government is more reactive and not proactive. A partisan de-alignment, small focus issue parties gaining traction. Okay, what do you think?
I think those are a lot of great points. And you'll see in my kind of quick jot noting here, I come up with a lot of similar things. So what makes it more likely? The necessity of collective action. So we've shown in the pandemic that we need to work together, make common efforts to achieve serious change. increased willingness to spend for the public good. So in the pandemic, we've spent a lot on things like healthcare, on protecting infrastructure, supporting small businesses. So if we're willing to spend that money, we might be more willing to spend other money. Increased awareness of risks to others. So we've had more focus on kind of the collective good and collective well-being in our society throughout COVID than we had before that might apply here. We might have incentivized working with other countries. So some of you talked about how we've worked together through intergovernmental organizations. That could be really helpful in addressing climate change. And we might have an increased focus on science and scientific development. So we've invested money into vaccine research. We've shown the capacity for science to address major issues, and we could see similar investments and increased focus on climate change or environmental issues. So what makes it less likely? One, we spent a lot of money, and this is again what you guys were talking about. We might have economic concerns where we are focused on economic growth, on increasing GDP. We want to minimize spending, whatever it may be, and that's going to be a big one. Businesses need to recover, kind of linked. We don't want to put more taxes on businesses. We don't want to keep working on that. People don't want to make more sacrifices, so we may think that we've had enough of this sacrificing for the common good and want to move past it. We've had some public backlash to scientific projects, anti-vax movements, whatever it may be. And also international organizations didn't always do a great job with COVID. We have had issues with the World Health Organization, with the UN, and so on. So this isn't an essay yet. This is just me in a minute or so coming up with, okay, what comes to mind? I'm just going to list things off as quickly as I can. So how do you get from this to an actual essay that can get you into Oxford? So we have our brainstorming on the side and a rough outline. So first, what is our introduction going to look like? So I think the first thing we want to do in our introductions here is our definitions. So I've given one here. Earlier, I noted serious political action was the kind of vague term. So I've just said something that doesn't tell us a lot, but just large scale efforts to prioritize the environment, even at the expense of other goals, and then outline the essay. So this can be very quick, but just I'm going to talk about point 1, point 2, point 3. I'm going to argue that in each of these cases, the COVID-19 pandemic makes serious political action on climate and environmental issues more likely, which is what I'm doing in this outlined essay. And there you go. You've got your introduction done onto your body. And this is where you start comparing pros and cons. So or in this case, more likely or less likely. So as I said earlier, what they really want to show here is your ability to think about these things critically and to compare different benefits. I don't just want to write an essay where I'm saying it's more likely. Here is 5 reasons why it's more likely. There you go. I want to actually compare my reasons for one or the other. So my first kind of grouping here is just, do people care more? So do we care more about working together, about climate issues, whatever it may be? And we see less likely some may be fed up with making sacrifices. So this was one of my brainstorming points. People have been giving up a lot. We have an increased movement to get out of the pandemic, to move past it. We don't want to keep making more sacrifices for the common good. But I'm going to argue that this is weaker than the reason why it's more likely. The majority actually showed a willingness to work with others and to accept these temporary sacrifices. And that is a reason to believe it is more likely that outweighs the similar reason to make it less likely. And the focus here is on how I'm comparing the two and how I'm analyzing how they fit in with each other. Second brief body paragraph. And again, kind of a broad heading for it. So we have a question of, can the world work together? So we have it's less likely. We've had some struggles with international organizations. And here I might be able to throw in some specific knowledge. For example, I've read an article about how the World Health Organization had favored China in the early days. So I can reference that very quickly. But then I'm going to say, even though there's reason to believe it's less likely here, overall, we're more likely to make progress. We've had cooperation with scientific advancement, with our vaccine distribution, and so on. So we think the world can work together. The pandemic has helped show that. Finally, I've grouped things together in terms of kind of our economic category. So is it economically viable to do? So what makes it less likely? Well, we think we've spent a lot, businesses are struggling, we're really doing poorly. But I still think it's more likely because we've shown that governments can take big financial losses for the greater good. we've been able to move forward and invest efficiently in these things. Yeah. So in all of these cases, what I've done is I've set a balanced argument. I've had, here's a reason why it's less likely, here's a reason why it might be more likely, and I've done my work to compare the two. So even though someone might make this argument, I believe this argument is stronger. And then finally, for your conclusion, it's going to be really quick. I wouldn't recommend writing more than 1 or 2 sentences for a conclusion, which is just saying something like, I therefore believe that the response to the COVID-19 pandemic makes serious political action more likely. It is economically viable. It is feasible on an international level, and we care about each other enough to make it happen. Essay is done. You're panicked. You're stressing. You're being told to put your pen down, and you are done your Oxford TSA.
Okay, sounds good. That's really, really helpful, actually, especially the bits about comparing and weighing up each of the points, I think. So
I just want to add, someone asked, like, do you have to balance arguments or pick a side? The answer is kind of both. But you do have to, like, it is best to argue towards a specific point, and that's because they want to see your ability to make an argument. It does have to be a carefully considered and justified argument, but if you're just like listing points, or if you never consider any possible counter arguments, then you're not showing certain skills that are important. I want to say one more thing, which is like, unlike the section 1, this isn't just scored out of 50. They'll like send your scripts to the college. So
the actual people who are interviewing you will see this, won't they?
You'll probably never actually see your score for the essay unless you specifically request TSA feedback from the college you applied for. You'll get your form back that gives you like your TSA section 1 scores, but your TSA section 2, the tutors who are interviewing you will read it and they'll make their own grade for it and compare it to everything else, but you won't see that, and it's not an important number in the same way.
Component 3, PPE interviews. I think firstly, it's important to remember it's not a job interview. It's not necessarily about how polished you come across, and it's not going to be asking you about skills and transferable skills. What an Oxford interview is like a sample tutorial. You're going to be taught by these tutors very closely. You're going to be in small groups being taught by them, and they want to know that they can teach you. They want to know that you're going to be teachable. They want to know that you're going to benefit from that small group environment. So it's going to be very academic. And what might an interview question look like? So these are the 3 questions we gave you, I believe. Chris, am I right in thinking that? Okay, so the first one is helicopter money?
Sorry, not the ones on this side.
Okay. So here are some examples. I'm going to look at some other ones in a second. So is helicopter money a good economic policy? In politics, should governments use targeted surveillance programs? And in philosophy, when can you be sure that you know something? Okay, these are the kind of things you might get asked. They seem quite open-ended. And Josh will talk us through how you're meant to go about answering questions like this. Josh, did you want to say anything more on this?
Yeah, I mean, just these are all questions that I was specifically asked at my interview, these examples at my interviews for each of these. The questions coming up are also either ones I was asked at my interviews or people I know or other tutors here were asked at theirs. So these should all be reflective of the types of things you actually will get when you're in an Oxford room or on Zoom doing an interview.
Okay, all right. So what do PPE interviewers look for, would you say?
I think the key attributes that they're actually looking for are first, how you understand and respond to new ideas and arguments. So for example, I was asked in my economics interview about helicopter money, and I had never heard of helicopter money before. They told me it was a process of just flying a helicopter around and dropping money at everyone's doors. But they want to see how I can respond to that when it's just thrown at me out of nowhere. And also teachability, responding well to prompts. So whether or not when they say something, so if they make a suggestion that I should consider the effects of inflation, whether I can take that into account, whether I can incorporate it into my thinking. And this is kind of related to the key skills. So they want to see how you argue, how you evaluate, and how you criticize. So again, they want to test your ability to think, whether you can actually argue for one side. So if you think helicopter money is good, whether you can explain why, but also if you can think about why that would be wrong. And they want to see you express your ideas clearly. So if they can't understand you, that's going to be a problem. And they want to see you correct your own thinking. because a lot of people are going to make mistakes both in tutorials at Oxford and in their interviews. I know there have been plenty of times where I've said something and just thought, what was I talking about? But they won't, and they know that'll happen. So if that does happen, they want to see that you're able to go back. So if you make a claim that just seems wrong or that you later reconsider, the capacity to actually think about that and go through it is really helpful. So what does this actually look like in PPE interviews specifically? I guess first actually preparing for interviews. So before the interview stage, before you're actually sitting in a room at Oxford, what should you do? And this is kind of just some reading suggestions. You can read whatever you'd like, but I think it's useful to have some background. And these are books I read or that others read that they found useful to apply for these. For philosophy, you want some intro to general philosophy, which is things like epistemology or metaphysics. So that's think, philosophy, the basics, and intro to ethics. Again, ethics, the fundamentals. These are just book titles you can look up. They should be easy to find on Amazon or the library or wherever else. For politics, I think first it's really important you read the news. If you can put the next slide here.
Sorry, I was just going to say, you've given some book suggestions here. And I also wanted to emphasize that in the book that you got behind you, the Oxbridge Formula book, there are also a lot of other book suggestions in addition to these. So if you are looking to expand your like repertoire of things that you've read, then this would be something that I would strongly recommend, like going in there and looking at the other resources as well.
So politics, read the news, read opinion pieces, read factual pieces, read things from reliable sources, just know what's happening in the world, and that'll make it a lot easier. Then also you can read some intro to political philosophy, for example, An Introduction to Political Philosophy, which is by Jonathan Wolff, I think. It's a really helpful book. Economics, also read the news. There's the classic things like The Economist, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, whatever it may be. Big mainstream economic publications talking about what's going on in the real world. And also you can read popular economics books like The Undercover Economist. These aren't as necessary as the readings for some other things, but can help you if you're interested in economics and want to be able to give sophisticated responses at interviews.
Okay.
So when you're actually in an interview, I think it's helpful to break it down by subject. Because again, like a lot of PPE, you do very different things for the different topics. So first, let's look at a philosophy interview. So there's two main types of questions you could get, this being very kind of broad categories here. So one type of question you can get is a logic question. For example, in my first interview at Oxford, which was a philosophy interview, they gave me some postcards with various logical statements like, the more I study, the more I know, but the more I know, the more I forget, the less I know. Therefore, why study? And ask me to just say, what's wrong with this? Or you could get logic puzzles or logic games, something to test your logical thinking skills. Or you can get open-ended questions, which are the ones we're looking at here, which is you have some broad philosophical question, give me an answer to it. So how should you actually approach these? What are the focuses? I think first, take your time. So philosophers really want to see that you can think your way through really complicated issues. So it's often easy when you're given, for example, a question about, is it ethical to push one person in front of a trolley to save 5? It's really easy to just say, oh, of course it is right away. But they don't want to see that. They want to see you break down the question, go through it, take your time and give a good answer. And be prepared to be challenged. Whatever you're going to say, they will disagree with, and you need to be ready for that. And finally, think out loud. So it's really easy to sit there panicking, thinking about things silently for a minute. That won't help you in these interviews. They want to see every step of your process. So even if it's just you planning things in your head that aren't a properly formulated idea yet, think them out loud, because that helps them understand how you're getting somewhere. So what does this actually look like for a philosophy interview? So this is a question I believe was sent to you before. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah.
So can a dog know that there's a cat outside the window? So let's say I was given this in my philosophy interview, which I actually was. How would I approach that type of question? So I think the first thing I do here is just break down the question.
Just a thought, do we want anyone to put anything in the chat, or are you gonna?
Yeah, if people want to put their kind of basic answers or what they have been thinking about this in the chat, that would be helpful.
Yeah, put in the chat, how would I phrase it? What's your summary of how to answer this question? Is that what I would say, Josh?
Yeah.
Okay, so put that in the chat for us. It'll be interesting to see your answers before we see what Josh came up with. Hopefully people have had a chance to think. So I'm just going to read some of the answers that are coming through. Somebody says, I think you first have to decide on how you know something and what a dog recognizes a cat. Maybe how a dog recognizes a cat. Is what somebody said. Maybe I read that too early. Everyone didn't get a chance yet. But I'd be keen to hear other people's responses as well. A dog will only know if there is a cat if it recognizes what a cat is. Okay, somebody says. Consider consciousness of a dog, so mental capacity. Dogs are conscious, thus they know the creature outside the window is not the same species. Dogs have an innate recognition, as argued in Plato's World of Forms, where it can retrieve information of the form of cats and dogs. Okay, some interesting thoughts there. We'll move on just in the interest of time. So Josh, what were your thoughts regarding?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I've done, which some of you have done, but I think sometimes is harder to do, is philosophy questions often give you some kind of scenario. And it can be really easy to get bogged down in the details of the scenario. So here focusing on dogs and cats and what they do. But I think the first thing I want to do here is just break down the question and what it's actually looking at. So what is the point of the question and what words or terms matter most? So I think the point of this question is that it's more about knowledge than it is about dogs. If you've done some basic philosophy reading, you'll know that knowledge is a pretty complicated concept and there's a lot going on here. So what we're really looking at with this question, if you go to the next slide, is that it's about what it means for us to know something. So when we're actually thinking about knowing something, what that means, where we're going with it, and under what conditions we can know something. And then we can kind of look at the possible answers. And they're pretty easy for a lot of philosophy questions. You have yes, you have no, and you have sometimes or in some situations. And in which case you can just kind of think why and what does this tell us about knowledge? So how would I break this down? And if you can go to the next slide. So the first thing I would look at is just
okay, sorry, I made a mistake. I was too slow. So we've got three options: yes, no, or sometimes. If it's yes, then it's a why, and what does this tell us about knowledge? If this is no, then why not, and what does this say about knowledge? And if it's sometimes, then under what conditions, and what does this say about knowledge? Okay.
Yeah. So break down the question, and again, I'm thinking out loud through this entire thing. So I come into my interview and I'm thinking, all right, I have this question in front of me. I think it's about knowledge. So what do I know about knowledge? One option for defining knowledge, which if you do some of the general philosophy reading I've suggested, you'll definitely come across, is justified true belief, which just means you know something if you believe it, that thing is true, and you are justified in believing that it's true. So I have my theory, and then I can say, well, how does this apply to the question? First, is it true that there's a cat outside the window? Well, that's the situation we've been given. So let's say that it's true that that's the case. Then can the dog believe there is a cat outside the window? And this is kind of our second question here, which is what some of you guys had jumped to immediately. So what does it actually mean for the dog to know it? Can we think that a dog believes it? So here I would argue, let's say I'm arguing that a dog can know that there's a cat outside the window. I would say here that I think a dog can have a belief about that, because a dog can recognize it, a dog can bark at it, a dog can see it there. All of this, I think, gives it enough to say that the dog believes that. And then the last question is, can the dog be justified in that belief? So I might say, yes, of course, it's justified because it believes this, because it sees the cat and it smells the cat, or it hears the cat, or whatever else. So it meets all the conditions. So I would argue that a dog can know there's a cat outside the window. But my job's not really done here. I've given a good argument for it. It's a great starting point. You've shown your ability to think, but you also want to think about how someone might respond to this. So it's possible that someone could disagree about the definition of knowledge. So you can think about other ideas of what knowledge could be or what it could mean. Again, this is easier if you've done some reading beforehand. You might think about counterfactual models of knowledge, for example. I won't go into the details here, but that's one way you could challenge this. Or you could just disagree with how the definition was applied. So maybe dogs don't have beliefs because they don't have language to think in, which means they can't actually have a belief about something. And then you'll give this answer, you'll get more prompts, you can keep going, but this gives you a good starting point for a good discussion in your interview.
Okay. All right. What about politics interviews then?
Can I just add one small thing, which is,
Yes.
so obviously we're talking about this from our perspective as a hypothetical student. And so we can just imagine what a tutor might say to us, but like one aspect of being interviewed well is actually listening to what the tutor's saying. They might in fact be teaching you stuff. So Josh has been suggesting, okay, maybe you did some pre-reading, maybe you know a lot about how philosophers have talked about knowledge in the past. But okay, maybe it's actually you're actually being interviewed on a subject you don't know so much about. The interview might be teaching you stuff that you then have to use. So there's how you answer the question, and then there's how you listen to the tutor, and both are important, although it's much easier to kind of practice and imagine the first.
Yeah, so maybe you don't know justified true belief, but then they tell you about the concept, and then you need to do this, how does it apply, why does it matter step on your own.
Yeah, exactly.
So politics interviews, again, main topics, you can look at political structures, so this things like voting, trends, political theory, which is stuff like, why do we have democracy? What are the roots of our systems? Or just kind of policy questions. So should the UK government invest more in stopping climate change, or some kind of action question? And focuses here, I think, tie in your existing knowledge, which isn't just books, it's about current events. So if you've been following the news, and I think it's especially useful here to not just look at UK news, but around the world, being able to know what's going on in reference to it, and just give thorough answers. So consider different options, different perspectives, different reasons, and try to think about all of them. So again, I believe we have a sample question that was sent to everyone. If people want to put in the chat how they were planning to approach this, or what their preliminary thoughts were, that would be useful.
Okay, so we have trends amongst each country, any fluctuations and comparisons between them. I think you've said what you're going to be looking at, but maybe would you want to explain or describe those any further? That might be interesting. Somebody says different parties had different success rates and had different ways to contribute to the population or even to bring a change in society. Somebody says increased apathy in politics and how the events in each country, such as Brexit, could impact the differences in the rate of decline. Somebody said a general trend towards alienation of voters. So yeah, you've actually described the trend and potentially given a reason for it.
Yeah, I think these are all really good answers, but I think my tips for everyone here are to focus on being thorough and careful in how you're approaching this. So how would I start looking at a question like this, which again, this was my first politics question. I was sent this as I started my interview and told, look at this graph, now tell me about it. And that was all I was given. So first I'd just think, what does this graph actually show and what parts of the graph stand out? Because I can try to look at the later bigger topics like alienation or whatever it may be. But first I need to actually look at what's in front of me. So what does it actually show? We get 4 countries, and I don't know about you guys, but I actually didn't know what FRG meant when I first looked at this. I recognized USA, I recognized Great Britain. I assumed F was France, but I had to ask, what's FRG? Turns out it was the Federal Republic of Germany. And also in all of them, we have decreasing party identifiers. So I took that correctly to mean political parties, but if you're unclear on something like that, it could be really useful to just ask or give your first opinion and then ask for clarification. And then what stands out to me here? Well, the US declines sharply after 1965. I see that trend. And then I see that all 4 are dropping over time, and especially after 1995, they're slightly recovering. And that's kind of just a first look at this graph. So what do I want to do with this information? What does it actually mean, and how might we explain it? So what does this graph actually mean? Fewer people are identifying parties. What does that mean? Why should I care about that? What does it mean for democracies, and what does it mean for parties? And then I can start thinking of how we might explain it, which is what a lot of you were jumping to. So I could talk about political apathy. So in my interview, I talked about mostly the US, because that was what I was interested in at that stage of my life. And I looked at political apathy and failure of major parties to capture rural voters in the US, increased alienation and polarization of politics. You can also talk about things like how more people form their own political opinions. There's more access to the news and other information, so people don't need to rely on political parties as much. And also just general changes in voting patterns and turnout. So you might have more people engaged in politics that haven't been traditionally interested in politics. And you give a good answer here when you consider lots of these reasons. So when you take your time to look at the graph, and then you think about a lot of different causes, you back it up with real world examples, real world discussion, and then you might get further prompts on some of them. So you might talk about political apathy, and they'll ask why you think that's happening, what major causes that is, why it might be different between countries. And this is, again, the start of a really good discussion on it. So lastly, economics. Again, 2 kind of main types of questions. So you might have maths questions with or without prep time. For one of my economics interviews, I was sent basically just a maths problem 20 minutes before, and I was told, work through this, we'll talk about it when you get to your interviews. Or you might get policy questions. So you might get, should we use helicopter money, or is helicopter money a good policy? And the focus here are first show off your maths knowledge and ability to apply it. So this isn't really focused on how much maths you've done, because people have done a lot of different levels of maths coming into this. Some of you probably have done higher or doing higher level IB or A-level further maths. Some of you may not have touched A-level maths. And that doesn't really matter, because they don't expect you to have done further maths. But what matters is that you can actually use the knowledge you have and make it relevant to what you're being asked. And the second thing or tip, which I found actually really challenging, was to use economic terminology to talk about economic policy. So when you have questions like the one about helicopter money, it can be really easy to just slip into kind of a politics analysis where you're talking about policy decisions, what's good, what's bad, what impacts it has, but you still need to use some economic terminology. You want to look at things like inflation, GDP, spending habits, consumer behavior, whatever you know, it's important to show that you can apply it in economics. So what does this actually look like? So here we have our final sample question. Again, if people can put their responses or suggestions or approaches in the chat, that's helpful. And then we can start looking at how I'd approach this question.
Okay, so figure out how you would respond to this and put it in the chat. Okay, so somebody says it's harmful because skilled workers would be required for the economy of developing countries to develop from the secondary sector to the tertiary. Skilled workers would be less likely to return to the developing country and use their skills for the benefit and growth of the economy. of the developing country. Okay, so that's definitely one viewpoint. I'd be really interested to see if anyone has anything else to add. Somebody says harmful as there are less skilled workers, so less value of goods and services produced by firms of the developing country. Somebody says harmful as a developing nation would be looking to diversify its economy and move away from the primary sector. It may be beneficial as the larger the population, the larger amount of consumption will be, which increases aggregate demand, thus leading to economic growth. However, more emigration of skilled workers will crowd out local workers, leading to larger unemployment in the developing country, which will harm consumer confidence. Yet in the long run, the increase in labor will increase long-run aggregate supply. Josh.
So, yeah, again, in approaching this question, I think the first thing to do, as with every question we've done here, you'll notice this theme is to start breaking down the question and thinking about what's really important. So first, beneficial or harmful is pretty broad, so it needs to be impact. We need to think about what it means to harm someone, who is being harmed, and how we can measure that harm. And also, developing country is something that is often used, but we might want to talk more about. So we could use our own knowledge, we could use general knowledge, so we could talk about UN measurements, World Bank measurements, World Trade Organization in categorization, and also we can just use varied examples. So I have a list of some here that you could talk about, but of course it's whatever you are familiar with, whatever you are interested in. And once you have this baseline, you can start actually analyzing the question. So first we might think about what agents, stakeholders, and sectors are going to be impacted. Because we say here that it's beneficial or harmful to a developing country, which is really broad. And a lot of you guys gave immediate answers that are focused on one part of the country and one way it can be harmed. But really, to analyze this question, we want to look at different levels. So we might think that it affects firms who are looking to hire very differently from how it affects the government who is looking to encourage unemployment or steady inflation. And it's by answering it on multiple levels and thinking about this question really carefully that I can start saying, well, it might harm firms in some fields because they are looking to hire these skilled workers who are no longer available, while equally those in, for example, rural areas may be benefited by increased interest in their production. So we can really break down the question further. And then we can start thinking about the how might we try to determine it part. So we can look at different types of economic indicators. We can look at CPI, unemployment, GDP, distribution of income. We might think about equality concerns. And again, it's about thinking about different ways we can answer the same question. And then we can tie this all into our economic objectives, and we can make an argument for what we think is most important. Maybe you think it's really important that we keep unemployment low. And now we can combine all of our answers from earlier into, okay, we think emigration of skilled workers is beneficial because we think that it lowers unemployment, which is our economic goal. And these are just some other examples of the types of economic goals we might have. Low unemployment, low inflation, balance of payments, growth, and distribution of income.
I wanted to just tie this back to what we said about the TSA essay, where a lot of people's suggestions in the chat, obviously you only have a limited amount of time to type, but a lot of you have said something like, well, I'm saying it's beneficial, I'm saying it's harmful, I'm giving one reason. And in the TSA essay, we're saying, well, really, you kind of need to, there needs to be a weighing, right? It's not just, here's the answer because of reason X. It's okay, I'm giving this answer, but it's because reason X outweighs reason Y against. And that holds here as much as it did in the essay.
So is it about creating like a nuanced argument and being able to kind of analyze the argument and the counter arguments and decide that your argument is better as a result?
Yeah, it's about being able to compare different valid arguments, because again, it's not a question with a right or wrong answer. It's one with a lot of different aspects and a really complicated thing. And the best you can possibly do on any Oxford PPE interview is going to be breaking down the question carefully and thinking about how these different angles and different options interact with each other. So
lastly, very quickly before the Q&A, I'm just going to rush through this actually, because I know it's getting late. So start now, do loads of past papers and keep a cheat sheet of all the little techniques you learn as you go forward. With interview prep, start early. Make sure you get loads and loads of mock interviews, realistic mock interviews. Again, it's obviously something that we provide. Keep up to date on current affairs and use a range of news sources. So not just BBC News, for example, but a range maybe of different sources in the UK, but also foreign or international news sources as well. And how much work is required? So on our program, we require that our students do a minimum of 5 to 6 hours a week in addition to their schoolwork every week. And we actually give you a very structured study plan. So it tells you, do these questions this week, then do that the next week. It gives you the full structure. And I think one of the biggest things students say about working with us is that they have a structure and they know what to do at all points in time. It's not left. A lot of students, if they don't know what they have to do, will procrastinate and spend the time looking for the stuff to do instead of actually doing the stuff. So I think that's one of the biggest advantages of this program. And in terms of study skills, I'm just going to go through this very fast. What are mistakes people make? Spending too long choosing a college, or way too long in their personal statement, not doing enough practice TSA questions, not doing any time practice, and not doing any interview focused preparation early. But what should people do? Plan their time well, make sure they have a work-life balance, and keep a timetable or a study plan. So here is a quick example. Chris, could you please quickly take us through this?
Okay, so this student, firstly, they're attending an economics workshop on Monday. So that might be, say, an hour. Then they'll do a TSA mock in their own time. The study plan will tell you, will give you guidance as to how often you should be doing mocks. When you do, so a mock is just you might take 2 hours on your mock, but you might not finish, say you're doing section 1, you might not finish all the section 1 questions in the time you have. It's very time pressured. So in order to get the most out of the mock, we actually recommend you continue with the questions you didn't get to finish. So maybe they do that the next day. And then once they've had a good go, then it's time for them to maybe look at solutions, and they can mark the, maybe mark the paper, look at solutions for questions they got wrong, potentially others as well.
So yeah, there could be video solutions, for example, yeah.
There'd be video solutions, so you're watching them. So watch those, definitely watch the ones you got wrong, but if you have time, also the others, because you want to make sure you're using the right methods.
And the quickest, I would say the quickest and most efficient methods.
Yeah. As Paul said, it's good to keep a cheat sheet, so any techniques you learn, you write down. So that's potentially an extended process. Then this person's going to have tuition on Saturday, but maybe they've been given some homework. So they've got some reading to do. And whenever you do reading, it should be, you should be putting effort into your reading. So it's not just passive, and you might be making notes in order to ask the tutor on the Saturday about some things, or answer some questions they sent you.
Okay, fantastic. Next thing, make sure you track your marks. Do mark your work when you're doing TSA preparation and act on the questions you got wrong, and then interpret the marks. So a lot of you said today that you really enjoyed the fact that we looked at lots of graphs and you knew what sort of marks you needed to get. So figure out, am I on track? Would I be likely to get an interview? Would I be likely to get an offer with this mark? And use that to judge how much preparation you still need to do. And compare your marks to official reports or feedback. Look for patterns. What are the topics you're stronger in? What are you weaker in? Get help in the stuff that you find more difficult. And lastly, struggle for success. So it can be tempting to just rush through practice questions and look at the solutions way too quickly, not realizing the importance of independent study. So some problem solving questions are quite tricky, even though they're meant to be done in 108 seconds. Sometimes it will take you much longer to do them, but don't be afraid. Don't be like, oh, 108 seconds done, I need to look at the solution. Spend the time thinking about them. That will develop those thinking skills, those problem solving skills in your brain. And eventually you will get quicker. So don't be afraid of investing that time initially. Think about going to the gym. You'll be building up your strength and stamina. It doesn't happen overnight. You need to put in the effort. So what can you do? So make sure you do struggle with harder questions. And that's more important than reading solutions. Don't watch or read solutions too soon. Maybe even if you do watch a solution video, just watch 10, 15 seconds, get a hint, pause it, and carry on with the question on your own. Do as much as you can on your own, and come back to, make a note of questions you found difficult and come back to them. Because who knows, once you have a couple of nights sleep, your brain kind of subconsciously works through the solution and you might be able to answer it. And we have reached the Q&A session. So we've got 11 questions in the chat. I'd like to get through all of them. Josh, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, depending on the modules you pick in the second year, for example, if you pick philosophy and economics, will it make a difference to the level of the degree you achieve at the end of the 3 years?
I mean, the easy answer is no. So you can choose whichever modules you want, and they all will be of varying kind of difficulties for you. So certainly if you pick a bunch of things you aren't very good at, then it'll make it harder for you to do well on your final exams. But overall, all of the modules have fairly similar average marks and distributions of marks. Like they might vary a little between courses, between modules, but all things considered, you can do well or you can do poorly no matter what you take.
Okay. And somebody asked, are there any examples you can give for the titles of essays for each subject? So maybe if you can think of one essay title that you've written for politics, philosophy, and economics, and let us know.
So economics, the first one that comes to mind is one that I had in my first year, which was just incentives, work, discuss. And I had to write an essay on that. In terms of philosophy and politics, I'm taking one of each this term. So just in terms of essays I've written in the last 2 weeks, for my practical ethics course in philosophy, I had a question which was, is the personhood of the fetus the most important factor in determining the moral status of abortion? So that's a topical and interesting question. The one that I just wrote today for my theories of justice course was, which is a politics course, is disability simply a difference? So it was about whether or not it is inherently bad to have a disability or whether it's just a fact of having a difference. So those are some examples. It'll change a lot depending on which courses you take and what you do. But those are kind of a sense of the type of things you could get.
Okay, thank you. That's actually really, really interesting. If you do PPE, do you need any other qualifications, or can you start your career straight afterwards?
So I think the general answer is you can start your career right after. It'll obviously depend on what you want to do. For example, I'm interested in doing law, for example, and if I wanted to do that, I would need to do either a law conversion course or law school in Canada. But if a lot of the jobs we were looking at, so things like public sector jobs, finance jobs, whatever they be, you'll be qualified to go into right away after your PPE degree. You won't need to do further studies or qualifications afterwards.
Okay, next question I think I will ask Chris.
Oh, you muted yourself.
Sorry. Next question I'm going to ask Chris, actually. So if I only did 9 subjects and got all grade 9s, do I still have less of a chance compared to somebody who did 10 subjects?
Not really. I mean, very marginally. In some sense, their results are more impressive, but it's very marginal. The tutors are more interested in like how you did in the subjects you chose. I think if you chose an unusually small number of GCSEs for someone at your school or in your area, then they might wonder why that is. In which case it might best be addressed by your teachers, for instance, in your teacher reference in your UCAS application. But otherwise, I don't really think it's that big of a difference.
I mean, I think I'd just reiterate the point that we said earlier, which is that yes, the GCSE grades are helpful, and 9 grade 9s is definitely not going to preclude you. It's not going to prevent you from getting an interview. Like, they're excellent grades. What I would say though is the TSA and the interview are going to be far, far, far more important. And therefore, what's done is done with the GCSEs. Great grades. Yeah, you did 9 subjects, not 10. I don't think it matters that much. Just make sure you get a really good TSA score and you do really well in the interview. And I think you've got as much chance as anybody else. If you're putting questions, can you put it in the Q&A box rather than the chat, so they're all in kind of one row for us? Somebody asks, do you only offer this program for PPE? Because I'm interested in E&M. No, we also have a very similar E&M program. The E&M program has lots and lots of similar components, obviously a bit more of a focus on management. We still have the TSA mocks and everything. And obviously we'll match up with a TSA, an E&M tutor, and you'd have E&M mock interview. So the program is very, very similar to what we've described for PPE, but for E&M as well. Okay. Has it ever happened that during the interviews, the interview for one of the subjects, for example, philosophy, was very impressed by the student, but the other interviewers in the other subjects weren't? So a student was only offered a place for a degree of just that subject, for example, philosophy degree instead of PPE.
I mean, for PPE, there's no option to just do any of the one individual courses at Oxford. So no, it can happen with other subjects. For example, I know people who've applied for history and politics and have ended up taking just a history degree. But for PPE specifically, because there is no just philosophy or just politics or just economics course, there's no real option for that to happen.
Just slightly more generally, it is true at Oxford you have multiple interviews. So generally 2 at one college, 2 at another, or now it's online, but with one college, 2 with another. And it can be that you'll get a score for each interview. It can be that your score on one interview is not that great and you do well at another interview, and they take that into account and you do get an offer. But obviously it's better to perform as well as you can in all the interviews.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Are the TSA scores based on a percentage of marks, or are the points weighted for each paper and or section of the paper? I think we showed that RASH model earlier. So Chris, it's not just a raw percentage, is it? There's always a score conversion that's done.
Yeah, in fact, what they do is it's first converted to a score between 1 and 9 for section 1, and then that's converted into a percentage in a slightly non-straightforward way. But I don't want to go into all the maths at the moment. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, it depends on the difficulty of the paper. Like if everyone found it very difficult, you would not necessarily get a lower mark because of the fact that it was a hard paper. It's standardized. Okay, for the TSA, you be notified of when the 90 and 30 minutes of each exam are complete, or are you expected to spend these amounts of times and keep track of the time by yourself? If I'm not mistaken, Chris, I think what happens is after 90 minutes, one of your papers is collected, like section 1 is collected and section...
It gets taken off for you.
Yeah, and section 2 is then given out. So it's 2 separate exams that just literally take place one after each other. If you aren't familiar with the concept in an interview, how would you ask for clarification, Josh?
I mean, I think I would just ask, like, that it doesn't matter too much. I ask, just say, like, I haven't heard of that, or I'm not familiar with that. Would you be able to explain it? Or what does it mean? Or anything along those lines. I think the key part is just not being afraid to ask, because it can be pretty scary. But it's always better to just admit you haven't heard of it and ask what it means than it is to try to talk your way through something you've never heard of.
Yeah.
As much as we say, like, watching the news is helpful for your application, you aren't expected to know what every little thing is. It's just useful to have general knowledge sometimes.
Okay, excellent. Do you think somebody's at a disadvantage if they didn't do politics, economics, or philosophy at A level?
Not really. I mean, I think, so I did IB, not A level, but I hadn't taken any of those courses going in, and that wasn't a problem for me. I think for economics specifically, you will want to do some familiarizing yourself with concepts or ideas, because there will be people who've done economics A levels, and that just helps you understand the concepts. But there's no expectation. Like a lot of courses at Oxford, they'll say you need to have done this, this, or this at A levels. And for PPE, there's none of that. So you are all right to not have done any of them and still be applying. It might just mean a little bit of extra work so you know what you're talking about, especially in economics, I think.
Yes, I was going to say, it's like, I think the other thing they want to gauge is your interest. So even if you don't do them, how much interest do you actually have in these subjects? What work have you done in your own time? How have you come to the conclusion that you like this subject? So I think those, doing the work is important. Somebody's telling us they're a busy person. How do they fit in the work if they were to join our program? I think I would, if you're interested in having a personal conversation with your particular situation, I would recommend booking the consultation in. Again, I want to recommend, guys, if you could put the question in the Q&A box rather than the chat. But yeah, if you have any personal questions, I think it would be best to have a discussion. So I strongly recommend booking in a call. Are you expected to know as much technical knowledge about economics if you don't take it at school, or if you can't take it at school? I do a lot of extra reading, but I don't know as much as other people who have been taking economics for 2 years. So firstly, I'll say to that, we do have people on a program who don't, but they have like benefited quite a lot from those economics group sessions that we run. Because what we do is we actually give you pre-reading before that, which gets your foundations up to scratch. And then we take you beyond that. So I think people have found that very, very useful. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything.
I think that seems fair. I think you might not know as much, but it's a matter of learning as much as you can and being able to use that. Because they're not going to ask you to write down every piece of economics knowledge piece of paper. It's about learning what you can and then using it effectively to discuss or argue.
Yeah. Okay, great. Somebody's asking, what modules do you do, Josh, at the moment?
So yeah, this term, the two I'm doing are practical ethics and theories of justice. Beyond that, I've done ethics, knowledge and reality, international relations, theory of politics, microeconomics, and I'm going to write a thesis next year. And I believe that is my 8.
Okay, excellent. All right. What would you say the work-life balance is on the course? Like, for example, is there only enough time to join a sports team? And I know for a fact that Josh does lots of sports, and go to the gym, etc., while completing all of your tasks.
Yeah, so I think the answer is there is definitely the space to have a work-life balance. Obviously, you need to stay organized, but so in my time at Oxford here, I play on the University Blues basketball team, which is fairly competitive and is a lot of work. I'm also on the executive committee for our JCR, which is our student council. I've worked with debating societies and so on. So there's time to do basically whatever you want to do, and a lot of opportunities here. It requires a bit more organization and a bit more kind of, I'm going to spend this time playing basketball and then come back and then I need to write this essay, but it's very doable. And I actually think it's really helpful to have other things you're involved in while you're at Oxford.
Okay, yeah, I'd agree. I'd say Oxford is like a work hard, play hard environment. So like, you're doing lots of work, but you're also equally like engaging in lots of other things apart from work as well. Is the proportion of economics you do in PPE versus E&M different?
So that's a bit complicated. For your first year, it's the same. So in your first year, everyone's doing the same economics courses. In your second year, it depends. So if you keep all 3, you're going to do less economics. But if you do, say, economics and politics, you'll have the same number and same economics options as someone doing E&M. So basically, they're the same, although PPE, you might end up doing a bit less economics.
Okay. Somebody else, is there a similar webinar for E&M? Yes, there is. If you write to support@oxbridgeformula.co.uk, that is support@oxbridgeformula.co.uk, and we'll ask one of our colleagues to send you a copy of that one. Yeah. How long does a typical interview last? I would say, just because in the interest of time, I think around 30 minutes for a typical interview. Would you agree? Give me a thumbs up, Josh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. What tips do you have for improving your critical thinking and common sense? I have been brought up in an education system where I had to be spoon-fed information. It's extremely difficult for me to come up with my own arguments, and I can't improve however I try. I also haven't taken history since primary school, so I don't know anything about history which relates to politics. I would say in general, obviously I'm going to say this, but a program like ours is designed to help you improve your critical thinking skills, to help you think on your feet more, to get you out of your comfort zone, to get you thinking on your feet. So yeah, I think that could be a good option, but I don't know if anyone else wants to add any other things as well.
Reading is helpful, as long as you're reading things that aren't polemics, they're actually discussions. So imagine you're reading something that's like a good TSA essay, but the whole length of a book. Then you're learning the critical thinking skills you need to A, analyze text like you might do in TSA section 1, and B, write your own arguments like you might do in TSA section 2.
Okay. Josh, somebody's asking what you got in your IB.
So when I applied, I had a predicted 45. I believe I got a 42, but I didn't write IB exams because I was the COVID year. So I had no exams and randomly assigned grades based on predictions alone, basically.
I think knowing Josh, I'm pretty sure he would have achieved his 45 had he actually taken the exams. He's a very impressive person. Yeah, great. Okay. And then is PPE a fee course? I don't know what you mean by that, over 3 years. So if you want to explain a bit further, Chris, do you know what she means?
No, but if you do care about fees, they're basically the same for all Oxford degrees, except medicine is longer.
And most universities are similar. Okay. What's the best advice you were given that you think helped you get into PPE, Josh?
I'm not sure if there's one piece of advice, partially because like I was applying from a school that had never had an Oxford student before and didn't really get a lot of support. So I was kind of just learning. But I think what was most helpful was just focusing on critical thinking and like analyzing arguments, how that worked. That helped me both like with my TSA paper 1, but then also my essay and my interviews, really just, being used to talking about arguments.
Okay. A last question then. May I ask if it's worth applying to PPE if I'm only interested in philosophy and economics, but not politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is. So in your first year, you'll take all 3 and we'll have some politics. And I think doing some introduction to politics is actually really interesting, even if you don't care about politics, because it is important to understanding the world and how it works. And then after that, if you still think you hate politics, you can drop it and never touch it again and just do philosophy and economics. If you decide you're actually kind of interested in it, you can keep going with it. So it's definitely worth it.
I just want to add, I'm a bit skeptical that you can be interested in philosophy and economics and find zero interest in politics. The crossover is too big.
Okay, all right. Well, we've come to the end of the webinar. Last call. If you'd like to get yourself booked into a free consultation, you can do so by going to oxbridgeformula.co.uk/PPE-consultation. And I'm sure Jansu is going to be putting a link in the chat any moment now. And while you guys are still here, to the few of you who are still here, so I'm really grateful for that. And what is the biggest thing that you've benefited from in this webinar? Just put it in the chat quickly and then we'll call it a day. Oh, I can hear. Okay, so the information provided by the graphs, learning the significance of the TSA has been another big one. The overview of the application process, the extra requirements outside of just A levels, ways to think about how to answer questions, understanding the different aspects of the interview process. Okay, while people are putting things into the chat, in case you are thinking PPE, I'm not sure, I'd rather do E&M or I'd rather do economics at Cambridge, we have programs for all of those things. So if that's the case, get yourself booked into a call. We can help you with any of those. And we have very thorough programs for all of them. And the overwhelming useful information I gained from this, I had to visit Oxford and Cambridge, but this was more useful to me. I love that. Love that. I visited Oxford and Cambridge. I had a visit, sorry, instead of I had to visit, I had a visit to Oxford and Cambridge, but this was more useful to me. Out of interest, what did you find more useful than when you went there? I'd be really interested to know. Chris, could you put the email address in? It's support@oxbridgeformula.co.uk. Just put it in there. If anyone wants access to the E&M webinar, just ask for it in there and we can get that to you over the next couple of days. Apart from that, guys, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us and for giving up your Thursday evening. I hope you found it incredibly helpful. Wish you all the best of luck with your applications. We'd love to be part of your journey. So feel free to reach out to us if there's anything we can do to help, or if you think that our program could be of benefit to you. Okay, guys, thank you very much and take care. And I'll be ending the webinar now. Bye.